In this section, we're going to look at hypothesis testing and start out by deciding what is the logic behind setting up such a test. Now, a hypothesis, as you might remember from any of your science classes, is some sort of educated guess. And what we're going to do is break this down into two hypotheses. The first one is called the null. This is the starting or default statement, the null hypothesis. And it usually means that it's a statement of no change or no difference. That's the null hypothesis. That's where we start. Then we're going to have the alternative hypothesis. And this is what you're hoping to prove. So you come up with a null hypothesis, something that you are hoping to disprove. And when you disprove this, you will therefore be proving the alternative hypothesis. So we'll look at some examples. In the court of law, when you show up as a defendant in court, the default or null hypothesis is that you are innocent. We say you are innocent until proven guilty. So if the jury is not sure, they could go either way. They have to go with innocent. Only when they have enough evidence could they go with the alternative hypothesis, which is that you are guilty. So you are assumed innocent until you have so much evidence that it seems very unlikely that you could possibly be innocent. That's when you are considered guilty. Now, the goal of the statistical test is to set up some sort of reasonable statement, that null hypothesis, and you're trying to prove it highly unlikely. And that's again what we just did here in court. You start out with a reasonable assumption that someone could be innocent, and if you compile enough evidence against that, you have to assume that they must be guilty. Now, let's imagine that you are working at Outback Steakhouse, and you are trying to sell appetizers. You have this idea, this hypothesis, that mentioning a specific appetizer when you walk up to a customer is going to increase the sales, the total sales of your appetizers. So instead of just saying, would you like an appetizer, you would say, would you like our bloomin' onion, our top-selling appetizer world round or whatever? The idea here that you're hoping to prove is that you can sell more. You can sell more appetizers if you specifically mention the name. So if you want to prove that you can do more, you always start with the null hypothesis that the sales will not change. The null is always assuming that there is no change. What you will then do as your alternative is that more people will buy appetizers. So you're hoping to prove that more people will buy appetizers, but you always start out with the null or default assumption that it will not change. And if you have enough evidence to prove this wrong, you'll have to assume that, yeah, more people would buy. So another example, readers found an average of 45 errors in an essay by Jack McConnell. Do you think they would find more errors in the exact same essay by an Asian-sounding name, Hsaio-Ping Zhang? The null hypothesis is always a statement of no difference. So we would assume that, no, the number of errors is not going to change if you change the name. And looking at how we actually write that as a statement, we would say that the average, mu, would be equal to 45. If they found an average of 45 errors in this essay, they're going to find an average of 45 errors in the same essay with a different name, right? That's the null or default hypothesis. If you are trying to prove that there is in fact a difference, if that having a different name on the top of the page biases the reader to assume that there's going to be more grammatical mistakes or whatever, then your alternative hypothesis would be that the number of errors would go up. If you assume that it's going to go up, that's your alternative hypothesis. And you would write that by saying almost exactly the same thing as here. Mu equals 45, but we're going to change the equal sign to a greater than. Your alternative is that the mean is something larger than 45. And what we're going to realize is that there are only three different options for our alternative. It's to write it exactly like the null. You'll have mu and you'll have a number. But instead of an equal sign, you'll either have a greater than, a less than, or if you're not sure which direction, you'll have a not equal sign, and we'll see some of those. So here we have some guy golfing. says, this guy's average fairway shot with a 3-wood goes 214 yards. Would he hit it a different distance with a 3-iron? And here, looking at context, we see the word different. It doesn't say farther or shorter, so we're not sure which direction. So the null hypothesis is always a statement of no change, no difference. If it went 214 yards with a 3-wood, it's going to go 214 yards with the 3-iron. And the way we write that again is mu, the mean, equals 214. The alternate hypothesis is that it goes a different distance. The average distance changes with the 3-iron, and since we don't know if it goes up or down, we would say mu is not equal to 214. So again, the null and the alternative hypotheses look almost exactly the same, except for the change in the symbol in the middle. The change in the symbol. It's always going to be an equal sign in the null. It's going to be either not equals, greater than, or less than in the alternate. Another one here, it says, currently when asked what size would you like, 37% of customers order a large coffee. Just rephrasing this question as, do you want a large, or would you like a large, make more people buy a large coffee? If you think that this is true, that doesn't change the fact that your null or starting hypothesis is always no change. The proportion of large coffees does not change. People don't buy any more or any less if you change the way you say it. Now, just as we were saying before, it would be something equals that 37%, but because in this problem we're not dealing with a mean, we're dealing with a proportion, you would say p equals 37%. So almost exactly the same thing, except you'd use p instead of mean. The alternative, if you're assuming that it's going to go up by rephrasing it, you would say that the proportion of large coffees goes up, or p is greater than 37%. Now, when I'm asking you to actually write out the statement, you're usually going to be looking for the one with the symbols here, like p equals or p is greater than 37%. But if I'm asking you to explain what this actually means, you would be looking here. The proportion of large coffees that people buy goes up. Another one here. Claim, I am a 30% free throw shooter, or 3-point shooter. Whenever there's a claim, the null is to always assume that the claim is true. So if the claim is I'm a 30% free throw shooter, then you got to believe it. The claim is true. I truly do shoot 30%. My P is equal to 30%. Now the alternate hypothesis is what you believe to actually be the case. If you think I'm exaggerating a little bit, you might say, oh, that claim is too high. You might say, I in fact make less than 30% of my shots. So you say P is less than 30%. So when you're thinking about your own questions and what you could possibly come up with, think about some situations, what you do in your life after school or at work, things like that, and try to figure out what is something that you could change. If you had to isolate one very specific thing, maybe it is you play basketball and you want to look a different way when you cut. You want to look to the left when you cut right, and you want to see if that gets your defender to be off balance more often, things like that. It can be something very small like that. Or when I play video games, I will switch hands for what I'm using as my dominant hand, and I want to see if that makes me better or worse. So imagine something where you could change something about that, and then try to write up a statement that tests that. So is it that I am equal in both situations? That would be your null hypothesis, because it's always a statement of no change or being equal. Your alternative is what you think will happen, what you would try to prove. Oh, I think it's going to be different between the two hands. They're different with the two techniques, and you would say not equals. Or I think this technique is going to work better, then you would say greater than. Or I think this technique is going to work worse, you would say less than. And that is how you set up a hypothesis.